A lone rider, etched against the blood-red sunset of the Texas plains. A woman, her spirit as bruised as her body, clutched her two small children, their fate hanging by a thread at a desolate slave auction. This isn't just a story of the Old West. It's the true account of how one man's act of defiance, a single moment of compassion in a world of cruelty, ignited a firestorm that would either forge a community or burn it to the ground. What happened next in the dusty town of Redemption Creek wasn't just a chapter in history, it was a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. The dust of the Chisholm Trail was a restless spirit, a constant companion to Josiah Joe Redding. It settled in the lines etched around his pale blue eyes, a permanent reminder of the miles he'd traveled and the things he'd seen. A former Union sharpshooter, Joe rode not with the swagger of a victor, but with the quiet weariness of a man who had seen too much of what men were capable of. The war had promised a new dawn, a cleansing of the nation's soul. But out here in the untamed heart of Texas, the old sickness lingered festering in the shadows. He was heading for Redemption Creek, a name that held a bitter irony he couldn't shake. He'd heard it was a place where a man could start over, where the past was a currency no one traded in. He had a small parcel of land to his name, a place to raise a few horses, and maybe, just maybe, find a measure of peace the war had stolen from him. It was the unnatural silence that first pricked his senses. The usual chorus of the plains, the chirr of cicadas, the distant yip of a coyote was hushed, replaced by a low, guttural murmur that drifted on the wind. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in these parts, tugged at his reins. He nudged his horse, a steady buckskin, named Ghost, off the main trail, following the sound toward a shallow, sun-scorched arroyo. What he found there curdled the blood in his veins. A dozen hard-faced men, their expressions a mixture of cruel indifference and leering avarice, were gathered around a makeshift wooden platform. Atop it stood a man whose polished boots and silver-inlaid vest were a stark contrast to the squalor of his trade. This was Jericho Brand, a name whispered in saloons and on cattle drives, a man who dealt in human misery as casually as other men dealt in livestock. He was a vulture in fine feathers, and his carrion was on full display. Chained to a post on the platform was a woman. Her dress was torn, her face a canvas of purples and blues, but it was her eyes that seized Joe's attention. They were pools of defiant emerald, holding a fire that even her brutalized body could not extinguish. Clinging to her tattered skirts were two small children, a boy and a girl no older than 5. Their faces were tear-streaked, their small bodies trembling like leaves in a storm. They were twins, their features a mirror image of each other, a shared terror in their wide, dark eyes. "A fine specimen of womanhood, gentlemen." Brand's voice boomed, slick and oiled, as a snake oil salesman's pitch. Good for field work, good for housework, and with a spirit that a firm hand can tame. And as a bonus, 2 healthy pups already broken to the chain. What am I bidded for this fine family? A wave of nausea washed over Joe. He had seen the horrors of Andersonville, the aftermath of battles where men were treated as less than animals. But this casual commercialized cruelty in the golden light of a Texas afternoon was a profanity he could not abide. The ghosts of his past. The faces of the men he'd fought alongside to end this very practice rose up in his memory, their sullen screams echoing in his ears. He saw the other men, their eyes on the woman. their thoughts as ugly as the dirt beneath their boots. He saw Sheriff Brody of Redemption Creek, a man whose badge was more ornament than an emblem of authority. Standing at the edge of the crowd, his gaze deliberately averted. He was maintaining the peace, the fragile, rotten peace of complicity. Joe's hand, calloused and steady, rested on the worn grip of his Colt peacemaker. He could kill Brand and his men, send them all to the hell they so richly deserved. But that would only make him a target, and it wouldn't save the woman and her children. He needed a different kind of weapon. He spurred Ghost forward, the horse parting the crowd of gawkers like a stone through water. All eyes turned to him, the lone rider with the haunted eyes and the Union buckle still on his belt. Albeit Joe's voice was low, but it cut through the charged air like a razor. Brand's smile was a predator's grin. "Ah, a new player. And what's your bid, friend, Gold Silver?" "My skill," Joe said, his gaze locked on Brand. "Against yours." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. This was unexpected. This was entertainment. Brand chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a gravestone. "And what are the stakes of this contest of skill?" "My horse, my saddle, and my gun," Joe said, his voice unwavering. "Everything I own, against them." He nodded toward the woman and her children. Brand's eyes narrowed. He was a showman, a man who understood the power of spectacle. A simple sale was profitable, but a public humiliation of a defiant stranger, that was a story that would travel a legend, that would bolster his fearsome reputation. He looked at Joe's worn clothes, his lean frame, and saw an easy victory. And the contest, Brand asked, his voice laced with mocking curiosity. Shooting Joe replied, 3 targets, your choice of distance." Brand's grin widened. He prided himself on his marksmanship, a skill he often used to intimidate and terrorize. He saw the glint of Joe's Union buckle, and a sneer touched his lips. "A Yankee shooter, eh? I've put better men than you in the ground. You've got a deal, stranger." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering over his own holstered pistol. "Now see here, Brand, this ain't—" "Stay out of this, Brody." Brand snapped, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "This is a private transaction." Brody, a man whose courage had long ago been eroded by compromise, shrank back, his silence, a final damning act of cowardice. Brand's men set up the targets, 3 rusty cans placed on a fallen log some 50 paces away. It was a challenging distance designed to favor a man with a steady hand and a clear eye. Brand, full of arrogant bluster, went first. He drew his nickel-plated Schofield revolver with a flourish, the gun barking 3 times in quick succession. 2 of the cans jumped and fell. The third remained standing. "Not bad," Brand said with a self-satisfied smirk, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his face at the missed shot. "Your turn, Yankee." Joe dismounted, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed to unnerve Brand more than any boast would have. He didn't draw with the same flashy speed. Instead, his movements were fluid, economical. The gun an extension of his arm, his body a study in stillness. The Colt peacemaker seemed to leap into his hand, its report a single sharp crack that echoed across the arroyo. The first can danced into the air. Before it could hit the ground, a second shot rang out, and the can, caught in mid-air, spun wildly and landed a dozen feet away. The third shot was almost an afterthought, a final definitive statement. The last can simply disappeared, a puff of dust marking its demise. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Even Brand's hired thugs stared their jaws slack. Brand's face was a mask of disbelief, his complexion turning a blotchy red. He had been beaten, and not just beaten, but shown up his pride shredded in front of his men and the very people he sought to intimidate. Luck Brand spat his voice a venomous hiss. A lucky shot. 3 lucky shots, Joe corrected him. His voice still calm, his eyes as cold as a winter sky. The woman and the children are mine. He walked to the platform, the crowd parting before him as if he were a ghost. He ignored Brand's sputtering rage, his focus solely on the woman. He used his knife to saw through the thick ropes that bound her wrists. As she stumbled forward, her legs weak and trembling, he caught her. His touch, gentle, a stark contrast to the brutality she had endured. The woman whose name he did not yet know looked at him, her emerald eyes searching his face, a question hanging in the air between them. The twins, seeing their mother freed, rushed to her, their small arms wrapping around her legs, their sobs muffled in the folds of her tattered dress. Joe helped her to her feet, his arm a steady presence at her back. He turned to face the stunned and resentful crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, before landing on the seething form of Jericho Brand. "I'm taking them to Redemption Creek," Joe announced, his voice carrying a clear, unspoken warning. "They are under my protection." He helped the woman and her children onto Ghost's back, the big buckskin, standing as still as a statue. He took the reins, and without a backward glance, began the slow walk toward the town, with the ironic name leaving behind a humiliated and vengeful enemy, a compromised sheriff, and a story that would precede him like a thunderclap. The dust of the Chisholm Trail rose around them, no longer a symbol of his aimless wandering, but a cloud of uncertainty heralding a storm that was about to break over Redemption Creek. The sun was setting as Joe led Ghost into Redemption Creek, painting the dusty storefronts in hues of orange and purple. The town was little more than a single wide street, carved out of the unforgiving Texas landscape, lined with a collection of weathered wooden buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a church with a leaning steeple, and a handful of houses made up the whole of the place. It was a town clinging to existence by its fingernails, a place where hope and desperation walked hand in hand. Joe's arrival did not go unnoticed. The sight of the tall, grim-faced stranger leading a horse that carried a bruised woman and 2 dark-skinned children brought the town to a standstill. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations in the saloon died down, and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Joe could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. His first stop was the boarding house, a 2-story building with a peeling sign that read, "Mrs. Gable's Rooms for Gentlemen." A stern-faced woman, with hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch. Her skin opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes took in the scene with a swift, judgmental glance, lingering on the woman and children. "We're full," she said, her voice as starched as her apron. "I have money," Joe said, reaching into his pocket. "I said, we're full." Mrs. Gable repeated, her eyes narrowing. "We don't have room for your kind." The unspoken words and their kind hung in the air, thick and poisonous. She closed the door with a decisive click. Joe's jaw tightened. He turned to the church, its white paint flaking the cross on its steeple, silhouetted against the dying light. The pastor, a portly man named Reverend Miller, met him on the steps, his hands clasped over his ample belly. "My son." The Reverend began, his voice oozing a practiced piety. "The house of the Lord is open to all for prayer and supplication." "They need a roof over their heads," Reverend Joe said, cutting through the pleasantries. "Not just prayers." Reverend Miller's benevolent smile faltered. He looked at the woman, her face a testament to recent violence, and the two small children, their eyes wide with fear. "The church, you see. It has no quarters for lodging. It would be unseemly. But I will pray for you. I will pray for God to show you the way." Joe turned away in disgust. The hypocrisy was a taste he knew all too well. He had seen men pray to God on Sunday and commit unspeakable sins on Monday. Dejected and weary, he led Ghost toward the edge of town, toward the small plot of land that was his only claim in this world. There at the edge of his property stood a dilapidated shack, little more than a collection of rotting planks and a leaky roof. It had been used by the previous owner to store tools and tack. It was all he had to offer. As he helped the woman and children down from the horse, he saw a figure emerge from the shadows of the general store. It was a woman, her hair the color of spun copper, her face weathered by the Texas sun, but still handsome. She moved with a purposefulness that belied her age. This was Martha O'Connell, the widowed owner of the town's general store, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper business sense. Martha had seen it all. Joe's arrival, the rejection at the boarding house, the hollow platitudes of the Reverend. She had a daughter, once a girl named Sarah, who had been taken by fever a decade ago. Something in the haunted eyes of the little girl, clinging to her mother's dress, tugged at a string deep inside her, a string she thought had long since snapped. She disappeared into her store and emerged a few minutes later with a large basket. Without a word, she marched toward Joe's property, her boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Joe watched her approach, his hand instinctively moving closer to his gun. "Don't you go pointing that thing at me." "Josiah Redding," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm not here to cause trouble, unlike the rest of this God-forsaken town." She stopped in front of the woman, her gaze softening as she took in the extent of her injuries. She knelt down, her eyes meeting the children's. "Hello there," she said gently. "I'm Martha." The little boy, his fear momentarily eclipsed by curiosity, peeked out from behind his mother's legs. The girl remained hidden, her small hand clutching a fold of her mother's dress. Martha opened the basket. Inside was a loaf of freshly baked bread, a wedge of cheese, a jar of milk, and most importantly, a tin of salve and clean bandages. "This is for the little ones," she said, offering the food to the woman. "And this is for you." She held out the salve and bandages. The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking from Martha to Joe, suspicion warring with a desperate need. "It's all right, Joe," said his voice, low and reassuring. "Her name is Martha. She's a friend." The woman finally reached out and took the items, her fingers brushing against Martha's. A silent understanding passed between the two women, a bond forged in shared humanity in a town that seemed to have forgotten its meaning. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. It was the first time Joe had heard her speak. "The name's Julie." She added, her gaze still downcast. Martha nodded, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "You get yourself and those children settled, Julie. You'll find not everyone in Redemption Creek has a heart made of stone." With that, she turned and walked back toward her store, her back straight, her head held high. Joe led Julie and the twins, Leo and Luna, into the shack. It was small and smelled of dust and decay, but it was shelter. He gave them his bedroll and the blankets Martha had brought, then set about making the place as habitable as he could, patching the holes in the walls with scraps of wood and canvas. Later that night, as the children slept huddled together for warmth, Julie finally began to speak. Her words came in fits and starts, fragmented and painful. She told him of a life before this, of a husband, a blacksmith named Matteo, a man with strong hands and a gentle heart. They had been traveling west, seeking a new life when they were ambushed by Brand and his men. Matteo had fought back, and they had killed him for it. She had been a captive for weeks, her spirit ground down by cruelty and despair. As she spoke, Joe saw the true depth of Jericho Brand's depravity. This wasn't just about the slave trade. It was about a predatory cruelty, a man who took pleasure in destroying lives. He also saw the incredible resilience of the woman sitting before him, a woman who had endured the unimaginable to protect her children. The fragile peace of their first night was shattered 2 days later. 2 of Brand's men, a hulking brute with a flattened nose and a wiry, ferret-faced man, rode into town. They made no secret of their purpose, heading straight for the saloon, their voices loud and belligerent. "We're here for Brand's property," the big man announced, slamming his fist on the bar. "A woman and 2 pups. The man who took them is harboring a thief." The news spread through the town like wildfire. Joe was in the small corral behind the shack, working with Ghost when he saw them approaching. He sent Julie and the children inside, telling them to stay hidden. Redding, the ferret-faced man, called out his hand, resting on the butt of his gun. "Brand wants what's his. Give us the woman and the kids, and he might let you live." Joe walked toward them, his movements slow and deliberate. "She's not property," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's not going anywhere." From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure moving in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge. It was the blacksmith, a man the town called Stumpy on account of his missing leg. He was leaning on a crutch, but in his hand he held a heavy smithing hammer. The brute charged, his fists raised. Joe, using his army training, sidestepped the clumsy attack, using the man's momentum against him. He brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the man's wrist, and the brute howled in pain. The ferret-faced man drew his gun, but before he could aim, a heavy hammer flew through the air, striking him squarely in the chest. He went down with a sickening thud, the air knocked out of his lungs. Stumpy limped forward, his face a mask of grim determination. "Get out of this town," he growled at the 2 men who were now scrambling to their feet. "And tell Brand that Redemption Creek ain't his private hunting ground." The 2 thugs, outmatched and humiliated, beat a hasty retreat, their threats and curses lost on the wind. The confrontation had been public and brutal. It drew Sheriff Brody out of his office, his face a mixture of anger and fear. He wasn't angry at Brand's men. He was angry at Joe for disrupting the town's ugly equilibrium. "Redding, you're causing trouble," Brody said, his voice shaking slightly. "Serious trouble. Jericho Brand is not a man to be crossed." From a short distance away, watching from the porch of the general store, was Caleb Thorne, the wealthiest rancher in the county. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a cold, calculating glint. He saw Joe not as a hero, but as a complication, a disruption to the established order he so carefully controlled. "The sheriff's right," Thorne said, his voice smooth and authoritative. He walked over his expensive boots, a stark contrast to the dusty street. "You've brought a hornet's nest to our doorstep, Redding. Some might say you owe it to this town to give Brand what he wants." The battle lines were being drawn. The fight in front of the blacksmith's forge had been more than just a brawl. It had been a declaration. The town of Redemption Creek, a place built on the shaky foundations of forgetting, was now being forced to remember what it stood for. And as Joe looked from the cowardly sheriff to the powerful rancher, he knew that the storm he had brought with him was far from over. It was just beginning. The failed intimidation attempt by Brand's men left an uneasy pall over Redemption Creek. The town was a tinderbox, and every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a spark. Joe knew their small victory was temporary. Brand was not a man to forgive a public humiliation. He would be back, and when he returned, it would be with greater force and a thirst for vengeance. The unexpected alliance with the blacksmith. Samuel, known to the town as Stumpy, was a small comfort. The day after the fight, Joe went to the forge, the rhythmic clang of the hammer on anvil, a constant defiant heartbeat in the tense silence of the town. Samuel was a man of few words, his face a road map of past hardships, his powerful upper body a testament to his trade. His missing leg lost below the knee was a stark reminder of a violent past. "You didn't have to step in," Joe said, his voice filled with a gratitude he rarely expressed. Samuel grunted, not looking up from the glowing piece of metal he was shaping. "I know Brand, or men like him." He plunged the hot metal into a barrel of water, the hiss of steam filling the small forge. He finally turned to face Joe, his eyes dark and piercing, holding a deep, ancient pain. It was 10 years ago Samuel began, his voice a low rumble. Had a small ranch down near the border. Good land, a strong well. A man came, name of Captain. Had a gang of cutthroats with him. He wanted my land. I said no. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory that still had the power to wound. He came back in the night. They burned my home, killed my wife and son. I took a rifle ball to the leg. They left me for dead. He tapped his wooden leg with the hammer. The man who led them. He had polished boots and a silver vest. He called himself a captain, but he was no soldier. He was a vulture. The description was unmistakable. Jericho Brand Joe said the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Samuel nodded grimly. He's not just a slaver Redding. That's a sideline. His real business is land. He finds people with something he wants, something they won't sell, and he takes it. He uses fear and violence to clear the way, then produces a forged deed, and no one is brave enough or alive enough to challenge him. The revelation added a new, more sinister dimension to their predicament. Brand's obsession with recapturing Julie and the twins might not just be about wounded pride. It might be about silencing witnesses. Back at the shack, a different kind of trust was being forged. Julie, or Julietta, as Joe now knew her to be, had started to shed the shell of fear that had encased her. She saw in Joe not a savior, but a kindred spirit, a man as wounded by the world as she was. She watched him with the children, his initial awkwardness giving way to a gentle patience. She saw the way he repaired the shack, his hands so capable with a gun, equally skilled at mending what was broken. One evening as the twins slept and the prairie wind whispered outside, she revealed the full truth of her story. Her name was Julieta Montoya. Her husband Mateo had been a master blacksmith, an artist in metal. Their land, which they had bought and paid for legally, was valuable not for its grazing but for something far more precious in the arid Texas landscape, a hidden year-round spring. Brand came to us first with an offer. She recounted, her voice trembling but steady. He offered a pittance for our land. Mateo, he was a proud man. He refused. He told Brand that our home was not for sale at any price. Brand smiled a soul-empty smile and said that everything had a price. A week later, he returned with his gang. They hadn't come to bargain. The attack was swift and brutal. Matteo died fighting a blacksmith's hammer in his hand, trying to protect his family. Giulietta and the children were taken, destined to be sold off their identities, erased their claim to the land, silenced forever. As she finished her story, she reached into a small pouch she had kept hidden. From it, she produced a small, exquisitely crafted metal bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "Matteo made this for me," she whispered, her fingers stroking the cool metal. It was the last thing he ever made. Joe took the bird its weight and detail, a testament to the skill of the man who had made it. It was more than just a trinket. It was a symbol of a life stolen, a love lost. It was evidence of who she was. Meanwhile, the divisions in the town were deepening. Caleb Thorne, the powerful rancher, had become Joe's open antagonist. His opposition seemed almost irrational, a visceral reaction to Joe's defiance of the established order. He used his influence, his wealth, and the fear of Brand to turn many of the townspeople against Joe. He spoke of maintaining peace, of the danger of inviting a war they couldn't win, all for the sake of a stranger. "That man Redding has put us all at risk," Thorne declared to a group of anxious men in the saloon. "He's brought his personal war to our town. Brody should run him out, him and that woman." But Martha O'Connell was a formidable counterforce. She used her position as the owner of the general store, the hub of the town's commerce and gossip, to champion Joe's cause. She spoke to the women, the mothers, the wives, reminding them of the fragility of their own lives, of the injustice of what had been done to Giulietta. "Are we a town of men or a town of mice?" she asked a group of women gathered around her counter. "Do we let bullies like Brand and Thorne dictate who is worthy of our help and who isn't?" The town was split, a simmering pot of fear, prejudice, and a dawning, reluctant conscience. The first major twist, the key that would unlock the puzzle of Caleb Thorne's venomous opposition, came from the most unlikely of sources, the quiet, shy twin Luna. She had taken to drawing using charcoal from the fire pit on scraps of wood and paper that Martha had given her. Her drawings were the simple stick-figure creations of a 5-year-old, but they were filled with a haunting, perceptive detail. One afternoon, she showed Joe a drawing. It depicted 2 stick figures. One was tall and wore a hat clearly representing Caleb Thorne. The other was a smaller, meaner-looking figure. And on this figure's wrist, Luna had drawn a small, coiling snake. "Bad man," she whispered, pointing to the figure with the snake. "Talked to Mr. Thorne. Loud talk." Joe looked at the drawing, a chill running down his spine. He remembered the ferret-faced man he had fought off with Samuel, the one who had been part of Brand's gang. As the man had fallen, his sleeve had ridden up, and for a fleeting moment, Joe had seen a tattoo on his wrist, a coiled rattlesnake. It couldn't be a coincidence. Luna, with the unclouded perception of a child who had seen too much, had witnessed a secret meeting. Caleb Thorne, the respected, powerful rancher. The man who spoke of peace and order was in league with Jericho Brand. Joe now understood. Thorne's ranch, for all its size, was struggling. The past year had been one of relentless drought. The creeks were running dry. The grass was turning to dust. A hidden year-round spring, the one Giulietta had told him about, would be a lifeline. It would be worth a fortune. It would be worth anything. Thorne wasn't just supporting Brand out of some abstract principle. He had a vested interest. He wanted Giulietta and her children gone silenced, so that he and Brand could claim the land and its precious water. A secret agreement, a devil's bargain, had been struck. And somewhere likely in Thorne's big, imposing ranch house, there was probably proof. The stakes had just been raised. This was no longer just about protecting a woman and her children. It was about exposing a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Redemption Creek, a conspiracy of greed and murder that implicated the most powerful man in the county. And Joe knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that Brand's return was imminent. The time for waiting was over. The time for fighting was at hand. The news came as it often did in the West, on the back of a spent horse. A young rider from a neighboring homestead, his face pale with fear, galloped into Redemption Creek, shouting that a large group of armed men, more than 20 strong, were riding hard for the town. At their head was a man in a silver-inlaid vest, a man who rode with the swagger of a conquering king. Jericho Brand was coming not to negotiate, not to intimidate, but to lay siege. He was coming to burn Josiah Redding's world to the ground and reclaim his property in a spectacle of funk and blood. The warning shot through the town like a bolt of lightning, igniting the smoldering tensions into open panic. People scurried into their homes, barring their doors. The street moments before filled with the mundane activities of a Tuesday afternoon were suddenly empty, a dusty stage set for a tragedy. Sheriff Brody, his face ashen, met Joe in the middle of the street. "It's over Redding," he said, his voice a desperate plea. "You have to give them up. It's the only way to save the town. I can't ask these people to die for your fight." It stopped being my fight the moment Caleb Thorne made a deal with the devil. Joe retorted, his voice hard as flint. "Brand isn't just coming for me. He's coming to finish what he started, and Thorne is going to help him. Ask yourself, Sheriff, who will he come for next once he owns the only water for 50 miles? Brody had no answer. He was a man adrift his authority, a hollow shell. He looked around at the shuttered windows, the deserted street, and saw the town he was sworn to protect, ready to sacrifice itself on the altar of fear. It was then that Martha O'Connell made her stand. She strode out of her general store, a Winchester rifle held firmly in her hands. She went to the large bell outside the church and began to pull the rope, the loud, insistent clanging a summons, a challenge to the cowardice that had taken hold of the town. One by one, doors creaked open. Faces scared but resolute appeared. Samuel the blacksmith limped out of his forge, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. A few ranch hands men, who respected Joe and despised the arrogance of Caleb Thorne, emerged from the saloon, their hands on their holstered pistols. Martha, her voice ringing with a passion that shamed the reverend, who cowered inside his church, addressed the small, growing crowd. "I came to this town 20 years ago with nothing but a hope for a better life, just like most of you. We've faced drought, sickness, and hardship. We've buried our children and our dreams in this hard soil. Are we now going to let a monster like Brand and a greedy coward like Thorne tell us who we are? Are we going to hand over a woman and her children to be brutalized and murdered? I say no. Today we decide if this town is called Redemption for a reason, or if it's just a name on a map where souls go to die." Her words were a clarion call, a spark to the dry kindling of their long-suppressed courage. The small group of defenders grew their resolve hardening, as they began to hastily erect barricades from wagons and barrels. Another figure stepped forward. It was the traveling preacher who had arrived a few days earlier, a quiet, unassuming man who called himself Reverend Elias. He had spent his time observing, listening, his presence almost forgettable. Now he walked toward Joe and Martha, his expression serious. "Mrs. O'Connell is right," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. He reached into his coat and produced not a Bible, but a leather wallet containing a tin badge and official-looking papers. "My name is Elias Vance. I'm a detective with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. "A Pinkerton. Here. I've been tracking Jericho Brand for 6 months across 3 states." Vance explained, his eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. "He's wanted for robbery, extortion, and the murder of at least a dozen people, including a federal marshal. The slavers he uses are just a cover for his real enterprise, land grabbing through terror. This isn't a personal dispute, folks. This is a matter of federal law. I have a warrant for his arrest. I am officially requisitioning the assistance of every able-bodied citizen in this town to apprehend a known fugitive." This was the second twist, the one that changed everything. The fight was no longer about taking sides in a local quarrel. It was about upholding the law, about standing with a federal agent against a notorious criminal. The moral ambiguity that had paralyzed so many was suddenly gone, replaced by a clear and present duty. Even Sheriff Brody, shamed by Martha, and now faced with a Pinkerton detective, seemed to find a sliver of his long-lost spine. He drew his pistol, his expression grim but determined. "What's the plan?" "Detective." The dynamic had shifted. Joe, with his military experience, Elias Vance, with his intelligence on Brand's operations, and Samuel, with his intimate knowledge of Brand's brutality, quickly formed a command triumvirate. They knew they were hopelessly outnumbered. A straight fight in the open would be a slaughter. Their only chance was to turn the town itself into a weapon. They would use the buildings for cover, the narrow alleyways for choke points. The general store, with its thick walls and rooftop, would be their fortress. Julieta, her fear now transmuted into a cold, hard resolve, proved to be an invaluable asset. "Brand is arrogant," she told them, her voice clear and strong. "He will expect us to cower. He will ride straight down the main street, a show of force. But he is also cunning. He will send a smaller group to flank us, probably from the east, behind the livery stable. He did the same at my husband's smithy." Her insight was crucial. They were no longer just reacting. They were anticipating. As the men and a handful of resolute women took their positions, Joe found Julieta near the back of the store where she was tearing sheets into bandages. The twins, Leo and Luna, were huddled in the cellar safe beneath the thick floorboards. "You should be with them," Joe said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her emerald eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "My husband died fighting for our home. I hid with my children then. I will not hide again. Today I am not a victim. I am a citizen of Redemption Creek, and I will defend my home." Joe nodded a profound respect for this woman washing over him. He handed her a small, easily concealable derringer he had taken from his saddlebag. "Just in case," he said. She took it, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the buildings, carrying with it the distant thunder of hoofbeats. The defenders braced themselves, their knuckles white on their rifles, their hearts pounding in their chests. The storm had arrived. Redemption Creek held its breath, waiting for the first crack of lightning, the first drop of blood. The soul of the town and the lives of everyone in it hung in the balance. The thunder of hoofbeats grew from a distant rumble to a deafening roar. Jericho Brand and his gang of nearly 24 riders burst onto the main street of Redemption Creek like a foul wave, a tide of violence and malice. Brand, resplendent in his silver-inlaid vest, rode at their head, a cruel smirk on his face. He expected to see a town on its knees, a terrified man begging for his life. Instead, he was met with an eerie, unnerving silence. The street was empty, the barricades of overturned wagons and stacked barrels, the only sign of life. "Flush them out!" Brand roared, his voice echoing in the unnatural quiet. His men, hooting and hollering, spurred their horses forward. As they reached the first barricade, the silence was shattered. A coordinated volley of rifle fire erupted from the windows and rooftops of the general store and the blacksmith's forge. Riders screamed and fell from their saddles. Horses reared in panic, and the triumphant charge devolved into a chaotic scramble for cover. Brand, his face a mask of fury, quickly dismounted, dragging a subordinate with him as a shield. "They're in the store. Flank them. Burn them out," he bellowed, his voice raw with rage. The battle for redemption. Creek had begun. It was not a fight of grand strategies or noble charges, but a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival. The town itself became a weapon. Joe, positioned on the roof of the general store, directed the fire of the small group of defenders with the cool efficiency of a seasoned soldier. He was no longer the haunted drifter, but a commander, his past and present merging in this desperate fight for a future. As Julieta had predicted, Brand sent a detachment of men to circle around behind the livery stable. But Joe was ready for them. Samuel and a few of the ranch hands were waiting in the alley, and when the flanking party entered the narrow space, they were met with a devastating crossfire. The surprise was total, the alleyway becoming a death trap. Amid the chaos, Luna's childish drawing proved its worth. Joe, scanning the battlefield, spotted the ferret-faced man with the snake tattoo on his wrist. He wasn't with the main force or the failed flanking party. Instead, he was stealthily making his way toward the back of the store, a lit torch in his hand. He was going to set fire to the building, trapping everyone inside. Vance Joe yelled down to the Pinkerton detective, who was positioned at a ground-floor window. Back of the store torch. Vance reacted instantly, moving to the rear of the building, just as the man with the snake tattoo was about to press the torch against the dry wood. The Pinkerton's pistol barked twice, and the arsonist felled the torch, sputtering out in the dust a few feet from the wall. The battle raged, a maelstrom of gunfire, shouting, and the screams of the wounded. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the ferocity of people defending their homes, their families, their very souls. Sheriff Brody, to everyone's surprise, fought with a courage no one knew he possessed. He stood his ground beside Samuel, his pistol bucking in his hand. The years of compromise and cowardice burned away in the heat of the fight. He was no longer just maintaining a fragile peace. He was fighting for a real one. Julieta, refusing to remain in the cellar, became a beacon of calm in the chaos. With Martha O'Connell at her side, she moved through the makeshift infirmary they had set up in the back of the store, tending to the wounded. She cleaned wounds, applied bandages, and offered words of comfort, her quiet strength a source of inspiration to the flagging fighters. She was no longer Brand's victim. She was the town's healer. Her hands, once bound by ropes, now bringing solace and aid. The most dramatic turn in the battle came from the man who had instigated the crisis. Caleb Thorne, watching the unfolding carnage from the window of his office above the saloon, saw his cynical plan disintegrating. He had made a deal with Brand for land and water, imagining a swift surgical removal of a problem. He had not bargained for a full-scale war, for the sight of his neighbors and fellow townsfolk fighting and dying in the street. He saw Brand's men gun down a young ranch hand who worked for him, a boy he had known since he was a child. Something inside him, a long dormant piece of his conscience, snapped. This was not the legacy he wanted. Cursing himself, cursing Brand, he grabbed the expensive hunting rifle from the wall mount in his office. He had been a pragmatist, a man who believed the ends justified the means. But the means had become too monstrous to bear. He smashed the window of his office and took aim not at the defenders, but at Brand's men. His first shot took a gunman off the roof of the livery stable. His second sent another of Brand's thugs sprawling into the dust. He had chosen his side. In the midst of the battle for Redemption Creek, Caleb Thorne began his own quest for redemption. Brand, seeing his forces dwindling and his victory slipping away, was consumed by a blind fury. He no longer cared about the town or the land. All he wanted was Josiah Redding. He saw Joe on the roof of the store, a clear target. "He's mine!" Brand screamed, charging out from behind cover and firing wildly at the rooftop. Joe returned fire, the two men locked in a deadly duel. Joe felt a searing pain in his shoulder as one of Brand's bullets grazed him, staggering him back. Brand, seeing his chance, ran into the general store, determined to face his nemesis up close. The battle outside began to subside as Brand's remaining men, their leader gone, and their numbers decimated, lost their nerve. Under the combined fire of the townsfolk, Thorne and Vance, they began to fall back their retreat, quickly turning into a rout. But inside the store, the final act was about to play out. Joe, wounded and bleeding, climbed down from the roof to face Brand. The two men met in the main room of the store, a space filled with the smell of gunpowder and the dust of overturned sacks of flour. Their fight was primal and brutal. They crashed through tables, their fists and the butts of their guns their only weapons. Brand was stronger, fueled by pure hatred, and he quickly gained the upper hand, pinning Joe to the floor, his hands wrapping around Joe's throat. "I should have killed you back in that arroyo." "Yankee." Brand snarled, his face contorted in a mask of triumph. Joe's vision began to swim, the world fading to black at the edges. He was losing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the storeroom. It was Julieta. Her face was a pale, determined mask, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. In her hands, she held a heavy blacksmith's hammer, one she had taken from Samuel's forge earlier. She moved not with the hesitation of a woman unused to violence, but with the focused, deadly purpose of a mother defending her young, a wife avenging her husband, with a cry that was both a sob and a war cry. She brought the heavy hammer down with all her strength onto Brand's head. The sound was a sickening thud that echoed in the sudden silence of the store. Brand's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his grip on Joe's throat loosening. He staggered back, a look of utter disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the floor, unconscious, but alive. Julieta stood over him, the hammer held loosely at her side, her body trembling with the aftermath of her action. She had not killed him, but she had defeated him. She had saved Joe's life, and in doing so had reclaimed her own. As Joe gasped for air, his vision clearing, he looked at Julieta. This woman of incredible strength and resilience. The battle for Redemption Creek was over. Outside, the dust was beginning to settle, revealing a town that was battered, bruised, but unbroken. It had faced the fire and had not been consumed. It had been redeemed. In the aftermath, a new dawn broke over a town irrevocably changed. The scars of battle marked the storefronts, but the spirit of Redemption Creek, once fearful and fractured, had been forged whole in the crucible of the fight. The air, thick with the scent of gunpowder and dust, now hummed with a quiet communal purpose. Jericho Brand and his surviving men were confined to the town jail under the watchful eye of Pinkerton detective Elias Vance, their reign of terror definitively over. Justice Vance assured them was riding in with the federal marshals. The town's most profound transformation came from Caleb Thorne. Consumed by remorse, he confessed his conspiracy, providing a sworn statement that sealed Brand's fate. He surrendered the deed to Julieta Montoya's land and pledged his considerable wealth to rebuilding the town and aiding the families of the fallen. Thorne's long road to redemption had begun not with an escape from punishment, but with an embrace of responsibility. The town that had once shunned Julieta and her children now claimed them as their own. Martha O'Connell offered her a partnership in the general store, a gesture of profound respect and friendship. Samuel the blacksmith, his own ghosts laid to rest, offered to help re-establish her husband's forge on her rightful land. The sound of Leo and Luna's laughter, once a foreign whisper, became the town's most hopeful anthem. Josiah Redding, the haunted soldier who rode into town seeking peace, had found his purpose in its defense. The war within him was finally over. He stood with Julieta on the porch of the small shack they now planned to make a home. His wounded shoulder, a dull ache, his heart full. They watched the townsfolk working together, their movements creating a symphony of reconstruction. Julieta's hand rested on his arm. In her other hand, she held the small metal bird her husband had made, its wings catching the last rays of the sun. It was no longer just a memory of a life lost, but a promise of one to be built. "Mateo would have liked you, Josiah," she said softly, a true smile finally reaching her emerald eyes. Joe looked at her, then at the healing town. The long, dusty trail of his past had led him here. To this redeemed town, to this remarkable woman, to a future he was ready to claim. The story of Redemption Creek is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the courage of one can awaken the conscience of many. It shows us that a community is not just a place on a map, but a bond forged in shared struggle and a commitment to justice. The tale of Josiah Redding and Julieta Montoya is more than just a Wild West drama. It's a testament to the enduring power of compassion, the strength of the human spirit to overcome adversity, and the profound truth that our greatest victories are the ones we win together. If this story of bravery, sacrifice, and the birth of a community resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs a story of hope, and subscribe to our channel for more true tales from the heart of history. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive.